How did the Ottomans get their name? By the end of this video, you will find out why they were called Ottomans. Who were these Ottomans? We'll look at the life of their leader, Osman I, and we will end with Osman's legacy. So let's start with the first question. Why were they called Ottomans? Ottomans was a name given to the followers and tribal members of its leader. Its leader was Osman. Osman is the star of this video. Osman was a Turkoman Muslim. He was a tribal leader, and he was ruling his tribe from the late 1200 AD. Historically, Osman is called Osman. He is called Osman I or Osman Gazi. And the name Ottoman, it covers Osman's followers, his descendants, his children, his descendants, and the dynasty that follows. In Turkish, it's called Osmanlılar, and in English we call them the Ottomans. So let's find out about these followers. Who were these Ottomans? Well, they were mostly Turkoman Sunni Muslims, and they were a mix of people. We had nomads, we had Ghazi warriors, we had frontier fighters, religious men, and Christians. All of these come under one group and one name. They were called the Ottomans. And if you look at the map, you'll see that they started as a tribe. They're living in Anatolia. It's the late 1200s AD. The territory they're living in is called Suud, and they have one single leader, and that is Osman. This tribe, these followers, they have a tribal lifestyle. So we're talking about tents, they're keeping animals, but there's also plundering and raiding. That is also part of the tribal lifestyle. And to begin with, Osman, his territory in Suud, it's quite small and insignificant. Anatolia, where Osman is at this point, isn't the big whole Anatolia that we know it today. It was broken up into little territories. And Osman was one of these territories. He was one of the smaller ones. There were bigger, stronger territories. So let's break down these followers, these Ottomans, who they were. So we start with what was probably the bigger group, the nomads. Who were these nomads? These nomads were converted to Islam, so they were called Turkoman. They were Turkoman Muslims, and they didn't always start in Anatolia. These nomads actually, centuries ago, they probably started life, their ancestors started life in Central Asia, in the Central Asian steppes. They migrate. It's a decades-long, very slow migration, but their origins are in Central Asia, and their origins are important. Why? Because of the environment, the harsh environment. The steppes environment in Asia was open grassland. It was harsh, and to live there made you a strong person. They were strong, they were warriors, they were resilient people. They had this strength. So why did they move? Why did these Central Asian nomads move westward? Well, there was war. There were problems with the surrounding areas, so there was violence. So some were escaping violence, and some were lured west by the promise of land, prosperity, safety. So these nomads are moving westward. A slow process, a slow migration, decades and decades, thousands of kilometers, they moving and migrating. Who are these nomads? Well, they're skilled archers, horsemen, and they're elite warriors. So they're migrating, but they're taking their culture with them. They're taking their tribal customs, very spiritual tribal customs, beliefs. They're taking their tents, they're still living in tents, they're keeping their animals and their horses. During this westwardly migration is where they're converted to Islam. And the conversion is with traveling religious men. These religious men are joining as they're passing through the Middle East on their westward journey. These religious men are joining the nomads, they're living among them, and the conversion is a slow, gradual process. And what they convert them to is quite a nomadic, and it's a friendly form of Islam. Our second group are frontier fighters and adventurers. Now, Anatolia and towards east of Anatolia was a different place. It was a bit of a wild west in the 11 to 1200s, and they are referred to historically. The historians call them marcher lands. They were a bit lawless. There was no empire or ruler that controlled this area, so it was a bit of a free-for-all. So it invited adventurers and fighters, men who were after power, prestige, booty, and some of these men were attracted to successful leaders. So these frontier fighters and adventurers, some of them were Muslim, but they were not all Muslim. Our next group, the Ghazi warriors, they were Muslim. They were all Muslim. Because our Ghazi warriors, they were converted, they were Muslim, and they were fighting. They had a religious purpose. They were looking to fight for Gaza, which is the holy struggle, the spread of Islam. Our next group are religious men. So primarily we're talking about Sufi dervishes. So these religious men, they were mobile, they moved with our nomads, they moved with our people. As the territories are growing and expanding or contracting, they're there, they're among the people and they're mixing. So they are preaching, that's one thing, but they're also converting to Islam and they're recruiting Ghazi fighters. Our next group are the Christians. So these Christians were potentially fighters and warriors after booty or land, and some of them were Christian converts. They'd converted and they were living among the Ottomans. So let's move to Osman, because Osman, he's the star of our show. This is all about Osman and his name. So who was Osman? Osman was a tribal leader and he was a warrior. He was also a Turkoman Muslim. So he shared the same ancestry as the nomads among his followers. Osman's ancestry goes back to the Central Asian steppes. His ancestors started way out in the east. They also migrated to Anatolia, their decades-long migration. So the late 1200s finds Osman. He's the leader of a tribe. He leads this tribe in Suud. And this territory, Suud, is what historians refer to as Beylik. Anatolia was made up and divided up into this patchwork of Beylik's territories. And the leader was a bey. So Osman was a bey of his Beylik in Suud. His tribe, his followers, they were mostly nomadic. They led a nomadic lifestyle. So again, we're talking tents, rearing animals, keeping horses. So what of Osman as a person? What do we know about his personality? It was a long time ago and historical sources were mostly after he dies, but the sources tell us that he was a successful leader. He had what it took to be a good leader. He would have had charisma. I believe he had charisma because he attracted followers. He was attracting, he was like a magnet, he was pulling followers, and there must have been something in the personality. It wasn't just the fighting and the military side, although he was a skilled warrior and he had a lot of military success. Historians tell us that he had a reputation for fairness and that he was a very open and flexible leader. He welcomed people into his territories. It wasn't just Muslims that were following him. And there was some religious tolerance. We know there was religious tolerance because Osman's territory, his Beylik in Suud, was very far west. He was the closest Muslim Beylik to the Byzantine lands. The Byzantine lands were Christian. So when Osman is growing and extending his territory, he's growing and extending into Byzantine lands. He's taking villages and towns, and there are Christians in these villages and towns, but he's not forcing conversion. So from very early on, there's a tolerance and an understanding. He is religious. He's a very strict follower of a very prominent Sheikh Edebali at this period in these frontiers, and he must have been quite close to Sheikh Edebali because he marries his daughter. So Osman is a tribal warrior, but he is also fighting for Gaza. He's extending his territory, but he's also spreading Islam. So what of his military life? We know that he was successful. What was success? He had a technique and he had a strategy. He understood his enemy, and his enemy was the Byzantines. And he chose his enemies wisely. He had tactics and strategy, and he was very successful at capturing. He was able to spread and grow his territory very easily. And Osman's objectives were twofold. One was to extend his territory, and the second was the fight for Gaza, the spread of Islam. And he is personally leading his fighters and warriors, raiding and their plundering. So his extending and his raiding attracts the ire of the Byzantines. The Byzantines want to slow him down. They want to stop him. So Osman and the Byzantines do clash. There is a big clash, and it's during the Battle of Bathian. And this happens in 1301. Osman wins. Now, historically, we know that historical sources, both Islamic and Christian, tell us that he personally led his army. So that is evidence of his warring and his military skills. So Osman, he wins. What does this victory mean? It means that the Byzantines have withdrawn and the territory around him is now undefended. It makes it easy pickings. And the second important factor is that he enters the historical stage. History records Osman from the Battle of Bathian onwards. So there's an important story or myth. It's called Osman's dream, and I'd like to cover this dream and what it symbolizes, because it's a story that's emerged after Osman's death, about 100 years after. So what is this Osman's dream? So the story is that Osman dreams. In his dream, he sees a moon rising from Sheikh Edebali, this prominent Sufi sheikh. He sees a moon rising in his dream. It rises from Edebali's chest and it enters Osman's chest. And from Osman's chest emerges a large tree, a huge tree. This tree grows and it covers the world. Under this tree are 4 mountains and 4 rivers. And the story is that Osman he tells Edebali this dream, he tells him what he's dreamt, and Edebali's interpretation is that Osman and his descendants are the chosen ones, and that they are going to achieve great glory in the name of Islam. So historians, how have they interpreted this story? It's a form of religious legitimacy. It shows the Ottomans as chosen, giving them legitimacy as Sunni Muslims to lead Sunni Muslims further down when they are the larger empire that they become. And it gives them also a religious foundation for themselves and for their dynasty. So what about the place of Islam? Where was Islam in the Ottoman world? In the very early days, it was an Islam of the frontiers. It was a little bit different. It was an Islam that was dominated by Sufi dervishes. In the frontiers, you had many Sufi lodges. And in the wild west of the frontiers, these Sufi lodges were places of safety, they were places of worship, but they were also places of conversion. And these Sufi dervishes were recruiting Ghazi warriors. So Sufism was very dominant and very strong in their lives. And it's a form of Islam that has strong spiritual awareness. And these nomads and these people moving and migrating, they had a different religion. It was a spiritual religion called Tengrism. And really the Sufi spiritualism, it fit very comfortably with the nomadic Tengrism. And that accounts for the success of the conversions. But historically we see that these conversions were not forced. There is not wide range forced conversion. In fact, it's total opposite. There is a tolerance. There's religious tolerance and acceptance, in particular for people of the book. So we're talking about Christians and Jews. So let's move to Osman's legacy. What was this man's legacy? He's given his name, his followers, his tribe are called Ottomans, so he gave his name. But it's more than his name, it was more than that. This was a charismatic and strong leader. He was successful warrior and a very successful leader. He grows. At the time, growing territory, growing and expanding was important, and he did this. He was successful at this. He also did things differently. In Anatolia, where it's divided into this patchwork of beyliks, Osman didn't confront or war with these beyliks. He focused on the Christian lands, the Byzantine lands. He behaved differently. He acted differently to the other Muslim beyliks. He was also this flexible and inclusive leader. He welcomed everyone to his territory. The door was open. He was tolerant, very religiously tolerant. And we're talking about religious tolerance in 1200s AD, in the medieval period. So he was very forward thinking, forward behaving. And that encouraged more followers and more growth. And this tolerance actually, it passes down the dynasty. The Ottomans are known for their religious tolerance. It's a pattern for the future empire. But Osman was also a forward thinker in terms of his heirs and his dynasty. He prepared and he planned and he laid foundations for them. So let's summarize. What have we discussed? Why were they called the Ottomans? They were called the Ottomans because that was the name of their successful leader, Osman Gazi. Who were the Ottomans? They were a mix. They were mostly nomads, they were warriors, religious men, and some Christians. And as his territory grows, that mix grows. Who was Osman? Osman, he was a leader, he was a warrior, and he starts a dynasty. What was Osman's legacy? He lays the foundations. It's his foundations and his children immediately after and thereafter that create these foundations for 6 centuries of empire. So we have these Ottomans. The Ottomans, they have their name and they have their leader. What happens next? If you're interested, please click follow to find out.